Let's say you turn up at your local airport for a flight. You check in, run yourself through the security checks, and await to board your plane. There are a lot of different people moving a lot of different parts that make up the airline. It's not just the pilots who make those planes work. Whilst you're sat in the airport, you'd expect the plane you're about to board to be kept in good condition, maintenance and airworthiness at an adequate level to suit your safety. But again, it's not just mechanics working on those planes who make things run. There are also those who you may never see, who make the decisions at the airline, and these decisions can dictate your safety. The story of Partnair Flight 394 is a story about negligence, poor maintenance, and cutting corners. September 8, 1989. Partnair is now a long-defunct airline that originated out of Norway. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, this airline, though it flew some regional scheduled services, also specialized in charter flights for others, utilizing a small fleet of turboprop planes, with the occasional corporate jets. A client would contact Partnair for use of one of their planes, and the airline would supply them with the plane and flight crew. One of Partnair's clients at this time in the late 1980s happened to be a small startup airline out of Ireland you may have heard of, called Ryanair. Like many small and regional operators, Partnair operated a number of older aircraft, and amongst the oldest planes in their fleet was a propeller plane called the Convair 580. The Convair 580 was just one plane in a family of aircraft produced by the American aircraft manufacturer Convair. Starting with the Model 240 in 1947, Convair produced over 1,000 of these piston-engine propeller planes across a number of variants, with the Convair 580 launching in the 1950s. This particular Convair 580, under the Norwegian registration of Lima November Papa Alpha Alpha, was delivered to Partnair in 1986. During its life, it operated in the United States, Central America, the Caribbean, and Canada before making the journey to Europe, where it was to assumedly live out the rest of its days, as its certificate of airworthiness was set to expire in 1990. So this particular plane had a very long chain of ownership dating back to 1953. Throughout its many years of use, the accident plane received some major modifications. These included the modernization of the aircraft's power plant, the engines, upgrading them from the aging piston engine to a modern turboprop. Another modification that was done was in the changing of the electrical supply for the cockpit voice recorder, which is interesting because investigators would later uncover something rather unusual. The CVR originally sourced power from the plane's battery. This was changed so that when the engines were powered up on takeoff, it would automatically switch to the plane's engine generators for its power source. What investigators discovered was that this upgrade did not work as intended. As it turned out, the CVR would, instead of running after engine startup, it would cut out during that transfer of power, meaning that when investigators would later retrieve the CVR, it had only recorded ground conversations before the plane left, before then disconnecting, leaving it effectively useless. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. What this is indicative of, though, is poor maintenance practices at Partnair. You see, this was an airline on the brink of financial ruin. It sort of comes with the territory with smaller carriers like this one. A lot of the time, these companies operate close to the edge of bankruptcy. To stay afloat, some corners needed to be cut. To explain what those cut corners were, let's talk a little more about the accident plane itself. Passengers and crew members complained about this particular plane. Vibrations were very noticeable on board, especially at the aft end of the cabin. Reports of these vibrations went back months before the accident. And before we talk about the events of that day, it is important to recognize that the disaster of Partnair 394 really started all those months ago. So to delve into this, we need to look at the plane's tail fin. It was discovered that at some point the tail fin was removed from the plane during maintenance. The tail on the Convair was fitted to the fuselage at 4 different fixture points. One of the parts holding the tail in place is called a shear bolt. It is fitted into a sleeve, which is then fitted into the lugs that hold the tail in place. To cut corners, cheaper, non-approved counterfeit shear bolts and sleeves were used in lieu of properly manufactured parts. Whoever constructed the counterfeit bolts clearly wasn't very good at it. Investigators later retrieved them from the wreckage and found them to be substantially weaker than the real thing. These types of parts are inadequate and break much more frequently. This was found to be a contribution to the vibrations that were reported on the plane in those months. The tail was prone to flutter because the parts used to hold it in place were junk. Before we get ahead of ourselves again, this is only just the beginning of the problems with the plane as a whole. It's a narrow space back there, but still here you can find what is known as the Auxiliary Power Unit, or APU. It's a small engine found at the back of airplanes, and here's the thing about the APU. It's used primarily on the ground as a power source for when the engines aren't running. Airplane engines are connected to an electrical generator, which obviously provides the electrical power for the plane in flight. But on the ground, when the engines aren't running, that is when the APU shines. It uses substantially less fuel than the engines to run, and it allows the plane to keep its electrical supply independent to the plane without the need of ground-assisted power. This already poorly maintained plane would suffer another blow to its integrity. The forward internal mount of the APU had also failed, that is, one of 3 mounts that holds the APU unit in place. This mounting was also believed by investigators to have been a counterfeit part. The spinning turbine inside allowed the APU unit to vibrate excessively when the APU was running. How this contributed to the disaster we'll touch upon in a moment. For now, though, it's key to know that these reports of vibrations went on for months. Partnair had actually kept in contact with the accident plane's previous owner, which was a Canadian airline based in Kelowna, British Columbia. They had substantial experience flying and maintaining Convair propeller planes. In July of 1989, Partnair flew the plane to British Columbia for supposed refurbishment with these expert Convair repairmen. For some time whilst the plane was in Canada, these vibrations reportedly ceased, and this even continued for some time when the plane was returned to Partnair in late August. It would appear that the problem had been fixed. Between the plane's return to Norway and the accident, the plane accumulated nearly 60 hours flying time. So what happened while the plane was in Canada? Well, maintenance workers did manage to replace just one of the counterfeit bolts that secures the tail to the rest of the plane. Whilst this one part was authentic, they never picked up on the remaining 3. So when the plane returned to Norway, the vibrations once again returned shortly thereafter. And by the way, the APU was still broken. That was never fixed. Which finally brings us to September 8th, 1989, the day of the accident, and wouldn't you know it, there were more problems with the plane. There had been continuous problems with the plane's left engine generator, and on that day it had malfunctioned, and despite the efforts to fix it, it could not be fixed on the day. In fact, Partnair had even accepted the plane back from Kelowna with this known issue. This generator was apparently known to fail periodically, and Partnair even effectively gave the accident plane its own mechanic to fly with to deal with its problems. According to the minimum equipment lists and Norwegian aviation regulations, at least 2 sources of power were needed for the electrics. This obviously presented a problem for Partnair. This aircraft had been scheduled for a charter flight that afternoon, but could not legally fly without 2 sources of power. So what was done to get around this was that Partnair employed the use of what can best be described as the bullshit technicality. because it was decided that the auxiliary power unit would run throughout the flight in lieu of the inoperative generator, which would remain off. So technically, the plane had two sources of power, and the power from the APU could be channeled to run the systems done so by the inoperative generator. Flying with the APU running is something you can do, but it's never really a standard procedure. The investigation was able to confirm this wasn't a new practice at Partnair. On at least two other recent occasions prior to the accident, the APU was running in flight because the faulting generator was never actually fixed. It kept failing. Considering the APU had not been properly cared for, it was broken, it would inevitably vibrate throughout those flights. Passengers on those previous journeys later reported those vibrations to investigators, noting they came from the rear of the plane. So let's now finally talk about that accident flight. The Norwegian shipping corporation Wilhelmsen chartered the plane from Partnair. A number of employees from that company's head office were traveling down to Hamburg for the naming ceremony of a new ship they had just launched. In total, 50 passengers turned up for Flight 394 from Oslo's Fornebu Airport to Hamburg in Germany. The two pilots who would fly the plane knew each other very well. 59-year-old Captain Knut Tveiten had around 17,000 flight hours under him. He had flown all over the world with his friend and co-pilot on this flight, 59-year-old First Officer Finn Petterberg, who also happened to be the Partnair operations manager. So it was the co-pilot himself who authorized the plane to fly with the APU running. Again, to highlight, it's not against the rules to do this, but he clearly didn't know the decrepit state of the APU. Flight 394 was late in its departure. Not only were there the maintenance problems we've already discussed, but according to reports, the first officer, also the operations manager at Partnair, needed to leave the plane to settle a financial dispute. The company, Partnair, was operating so close to the edge of financial stability that Norwegian aviation authorities ordered the grounding of Partnair planes until outstanding payments were made. This was literally just before the plane was supposed to take off. Co-pilot Finn Petterberg settled the bill himself, and the plane was allowed to fly. Departing at just before 4 p.m. in the afternoon, Partnair Flight 394 left Oslo flying south towards Denmark and Germany. The pilots climbed up to 22,000 feet with the broken APU running. The flight, once it was cruising over the Skagerrak Strait, appeared to be normal. The Convair continued over the sea towards the northern tips of Denmark. Hidden away at the back of the plane, the tail structure was vibrating excessively. So now we've reached the point in the video where we must inevitably discuss the internals of the tail fin. Obviously, the tail is where you'll find the rudder on nearly every plane. The rudder mechanics on the Convair consists of the use of pulleys connected to weights. They would move up and down, and this controls the angle of the rudder. For maintenance workers to access this chamber inside the tail, access is gained via what is called a shroud door. So what happened on this flight is that it's believed that the combination of vibrations from the broken APU and the tail fin created a resonating frequency inside the tail. The flight recorders on airplanes are typically located in the tail section. The flight data recorder on this particular plane recorded data with a needle that scratched readings into a metal foil. The tail of the plane was shaking so much that it drew many stray readings into the metal foil. Also, as investigators came to understand, this was not the only time this happened. The rudder weights concealed by the shroud doors and the rudder itself would swing side to side, leading to an eventual failure of the rudder system and the shroud doors. The rudder suddenly jammed to the left. Immediately, the plane yawed and overbanked to the left, putting strain on the already weakened tail structure. It is believed, according to the investigative report, that the pilots never diagnosed what the problem was. All they probably knew was that the plane was acting erratically. They had recovered the plane for a moment before the plane tipped over again to the left. This time, the plane would plunge all the way down to the sea. During this dive, the shroud doors on the tail fin were ripped from the plane. The shroud doors themselves returned radar echoes back to controllers on the ground, who began to notice the rapidly decreasing altitude of the Partnair plane. The pilots never radioed a distress call. Excessive stress on the airframe began to tear the aircraft apart. The poorly manufactured counterfeit bolts failed and the tail was ripped from the aircraft. From this point, the pilots never had a chance of saving their plane. It's believed that both wings were under massive gravitational loads as well. Roughly simultaneously, symmetrical sections of both wings broke away from the now ill-fated plane. Moments later, whatever was left of the disintegrating aircraft crashed into the sea, killing all 55 people on board. The crash of Partnair Flight 394 effectively killed Partnair itself. The airline ceased operating just weeks after the accident. The investigation into this tragedy took over 2 years to complete, and by the time that investigators were done, safety concerns regarding counterfeit aircraft parts spread all over the world. Airlines globally, especially in the United States, began overhauling their fleets as it was found that these junk parts were more common than previously thought. For the longest time, a black market of plane parts went relatively unchallenged and unregulated, and rules that were in place were rarely, if ever, enforced. All parts tended to come with documentation and serial numbers. These were typically forged, and it was incredibly difficult to track down where these parts came from. As it turned out, this wasn't just a problem exclusive to smaller regional airlines. The Federal Aviation Administration themselves were reported to have kept countless counterfeits in their own parts bins. Throughout the 1990s, an aggressive crackdown on illegal parts brokerages convicted over 100 people, taking an uncountable number of junk parts out of circulation, and our skies became much safer. Partnair Flight 394 was, for Norway, the deadliest air accident in that country's history. It was also one of those catalyst moments in aviation, as the disaster was the first high-profile accident in the modern day to be caused by this unique set of problems. Though some accidents have still occurred which have been linked to junk parts, there has never been an accident in the same scope as Partnair since. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to be subscribed as there is always a new video coming every Saturday. I've actually not been all too well this week, and you can probably hear that a little bit in my voice today. It's a good thing I got the majority of this video recorded before I felt really ill, but I am recovering and I should be back to my normal self in no time. Also, my move is pretty much nearly done. As soon as this video goes live, pretty much, I'll be dismantling my computer space and packing it away. Anyway, I shall waste no time and jump straight into that time of the week where I take a moment to thank my patrons over on Patreon for their continuing support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Shout out this week to Connor Ryan for pledging earlier this week. Thanks man, I really appreciate it. If you yourself want to support the channel further and even get your name featured at the end of the next video, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 2 days before it goes out publicly on YouTube. That is all from me today. In the pinned comment, you can also find my personal Twitter page if you'd like to follow me on there. Anyway, have a great day, and I will see you next weekend, just before Christmas. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.